Hello everyone. Welcome to Codex Tech, Rust Learning Video Blog. This is the part 2 of Rust WASM to-do app built in Dioxus WASM framework. In this video, we will start looking at some of the code files, and go over a few things that um, I noticed or learned during this implementation. Um, we'll see if we need to run the application and um, show some of the application parts um, as we look into those things. So let's look at the code first. So it's starting with the project. Um, so I went over the folder structure yesterday. Um, Another thing was to use the index.html, which I did not mention in the last episode or the previous video of this to-do app. So we use once we use the cargo command to build this, create this project. Um, so currently, Dioxus website mentioned using trunk, and which is what I'm using. I believe they are also working on their own Dioxus CLI that will make it easy to create project like from the template, and then also execute without using trunk. I don't know how mature that thing is. I haven't tried it, but I will keep an eye on that for any future implementation. So for any Dioxys, and I think same is true for the U application as well, the other WASM framework, we need an index.html. So I created this index.html based on simple HTML5 template. So only thing that I added was this line number 14. So as I mentioned in my previous video, that I am using Tailwind CSS, but instead of using it as part of the bundle and generate it, I just included the CDN link. This is just for the development or learning purposes. So when you include the CDN for Tailwind, it also allows you to include what other things that you want. So although I added some like forms and aspect ratio, etc., but this was just for my experimentation purposes. I don't think I'm using it as such in this project. Next is I applied this Tailwind CSS classes to the body tag. For instance, I want the white background with padding of 2 units. And as I mentioned in the previous video, it is so easy to implement the dark mode for any of the application pages. So I added this dark BG, dark background slate 800. So that will allow us to have a dark background when I'm using Mac for development. So when the Mac mode changes from regular to dark mode at nighttime, or if that's how you're running your Mac setup. So that's that's one thing about the body tag. And next is the div tag. So you need the div tag to render the um, contents of your WASM. By default, Dioxys recommend to name your tag or give the ID for your tag as main. I just wanted to experiment that if we want to have it to give it any name like root, for instance, to use another JS framework. So will it work or not? So that's why I use this custom div ID main app. since it is custom, so by default out of the box with Dioxus it's not going to work. So what I have done is um, that if I go to the main.rs, that will be the entry point. So I'll just close this one. So if I go to the main.rs here, um, on line number 7, I am using Dioxus web launch config. By default, if you look at the Dioxus website and examples, there you don't need to call this launch underscore config. The default or the standard way is just to use Dioxus web launch, and you just provide your app, your object, the main object, the entry point for your application. But in this case, since I want to have custom name um, for it, so I'm using launch underscore config. This is as I mentioned the documentation. It's available, and also I would mention that the Discord channel for Dioxus is very helpful. If there are any questions, you can go there, post your question, and someone will be happy to answer them quickly for you. So that's how I found out about this launch config. So you pass your app, and then the config, I'm using config dot root name. So if I highlight this one, so this is config dot root name, and I'm saying my root name is main app. So now instead of expecting just the main, it will work with this, and even I can use ID as root. That will still work. So this is one thing important I want to mention. Other thing is about the glue. So I briefly mentioned that we are using glue for multiple things. It allows some JS functions to make them available for your WASM app. So I'm using here like log root apps on line number 6. So I just create a log. So we're using log macro, and I just output like log that root log has started, and just a massive Dioxus web awesome starting. This was just for the experimentation and also to know that it has loaded or not. So that is it for the main. Let's quickly look into the other file. So then we have the lib.rs. Lib.rs is the main file, so, where we have the application entry code. So main.app was just setting up the the Dioxus is just hooking up the events or Dioxus how to start that. But in the lib.rs we have the actual code. This is the app function that we are passing as a parameter to launch config, and then we are using cx.render, and that RSX macro. This is provided the Dioxus, so it is used for rendering any of the contents like links, other components, everything. It has to be inside RSX macro and cx.render. And at the top, I would also mention we are using prelude. So on line number 5, so I have this prelude, so it will include all the required library that we need. And Atom store is from the Fermi. So I mentioned in the beginning I'm using it. It was not really required, just for my experimentation purpose. I just use this one. So we are creating a app store variable of type store. I'll show the store later on too. And we store the username, user token, and tasks. And we'll fill up these values once we make call to the server, or if in the actual application we are making call to the server. So once the user is authenticated, we get the username. So we display on the top right of the UI, and the token, auth token, we can store it, or jot token, we can store it, and task will be just to cache the values assuming like it's um, user is not using it from multiple platforms or applications or systems. And and also I have another store for the task. So initially I was keeping this one store, App Store, but because of some challenges, which I will try to cover later in the video, I created another a store just for the tasks. So this is our lib.rs and the main. Another important thing I should mention here is the this router. So router is my own component that I'm using. So as I mentioned, any component, either they are provided by the Dioxus or your own custom component, they have to go inside the RSX macro. So first thing I'm is starting with the router component. I want to render that and navbar. Sorry, one correction. Router is actually the built-in component, and navbar is my own component. And then I'm using routes.create routes. So important thing I want to mention here is that the placement of this router tag, this line number 22. So everything that we are doing in the Dioxus web framework or WASM framework, anything that we want to render whenever the route changes, like user clicks the add button, edit button, or anything, this is the client-side routing. For that to actually work, that action has to happen within the router tag. And that's the reason when we are building this app, when we call this app method and it is being referenced in the launch, the first thing I'm doing is I'm encapsulating everything in the router tag. Because the nav bar will have some routes, like when we click the login or we click the add, edit. So there are some routes that are happening. So nav bar has to be inside it. And then since any route change will be rendered because of this router tag, so now those components, once they are rendered, and this is inside the router tag, then we can have other functions like when I click save on edit form or cancel edit form, it will have the route commands to go back to, let's say, the home screen. So that was one important thing because initially I was keeping this one inside the nav bar, but then routing was not working from other screens. For instance, the add task. So we need this to be on the root level. Or at least this is what I found out. In other frameworks like Angular, there is a router outlet, so you can add that tag and then the contents will be rendered within that tag. So to me, it seems like it is equivalent to that one. So we are creating this router, we are using this router tag from the Dioxus, and it is managing the router outlet kind of functionality. I could be wrong, but that is how I understood it. Another thing I want to point out here is this navbar. So if I go to the navbar.rs file, this is in the organisms. So if you see, I have on this line number 9, I named this function with the uppercase navbar. So it's more like camel, uh, more like a Pascal case, instead of like the regular Rust requirement of using a snake case. If I use a snake case, issue only minor issue or inconvenience was that we cannot use this nav bar directly. We'll have to use always prefix this with the nav bar colon colon and then let's say nav underscore bar. So that was one thing that I guess learned when I was using this one. And another thing was that if I use snake case, then I cannot have these curly brackets here. I would have to use as a function call. So this is the style sort of like a guideline for using Dioxus. I believe U has something similar. So you have to use this first uppercase letter, just like a Pascal case instead of the snake case. And to stop Rust compiler from giving these warnings, I have to add this allow tag, so it will not give this false warning because this is how I wanted to use it. So another thing I tried to use in this one was to use references wherever I can instead of using clone, because in some other examples when we have to pass the objects, just to make it easy, people are just using clone everywhere. But I thought it may make sense to use references, although it may make it a little bit complicated, but hopefully um, that will be good, sort of like a good practice to pass the reference instead of just keep cloning. For instance, in this button atom, I am creating this property. So this is how we create property that need to be passed from, let's say, another parent component to this child component. So we have these properties, we call it button props, and I'm using lifetime over here for this structure. And then for the labels, instead of passing a string object, I'm passing the string slice. And when I call this library, I don't need to then worry about cloning the value and passing it. So that was another thing that I decided to add. So let's see if I want to show an example. So this is the account form, and here I'm using the lib button. I'll go over some of this code later on about how the form submit is working, and then also something that I learned about it. So, but here we are using the text input and the lib button. So if you see lib button, so I'm not trying to convert this submit to a string. I'm just passing a string slice itself. If I did not use the string slice in lib button for this label property, then it would be the string object, and I will have to call to a string, or if it was already there, I have to call clone to pass the value. So that made it simpler to call actually as well. So I don't have to add to string or to owned every time when I pass a string to the lib button. Same thing with the text input. So I think it made the calling code look cleaner, especially if we assume like atoms will be in the shared libraries. Although with the lifetime, the code looks a little bit more complicated, but it will be written only once, and no one has to see it when they are using it. So callee of that library will have a simpler way to pass the values. And now in the create account, this account form is the account form is when you're creating the new form. So I have used the use here. This is one of the Dioxus provided features. So this helps to pass the values from either parent component to a child component, or keep track of the state within the project. So I'm not using events, because if you follow the code in the U project, that I referenced in the first video, and I'll also include reference to that one in this video description as well. So the way they implemented was that once the value is changing, for instance, this atom for the text input, so whenever the value changes, the event will be raised, and on the account form, we have an event that will be passed to the child component or the atom. And then within that event, we can read the value and store it in our parent component. But instead of doing that, I use the Dioxus feature use state and create this username variable, and I'm passing this to the text input atom. So I clone this username and pass it down to the text input, and when the value changes in the text input, it will automatically reflect. I don't need to pass the event from here. I just pass this object, which is defined on, let's go up to, so line number 26. So this is defined here for this context CX and default value string default. So whenever the value changes, this variable will be updated with the new value that was entered in the atom. So if I go to atom for the text input, just to show it, so we can see here, so we have the input type, so we are passing text password, etc. But the main thing is this input props that is used. And if you see this last one is the input value state. It's an option, so either we pass the state type variable or not. So that's how I pass the state type variable down to this atom. And then if I see, so right here, so whenever um, input value, so let me go and find the on change event right here. So for this input tag, so this input tag is provided the Dioxus. So Dioxus has these tags that represent HTML tags. They are built in into Dioxus. You just use them as is. And for these ones, you don't need to have first uppercase letter. For your own components, you need to have the Pascal case. So I'm using this input tag, and we have this on change event. And whenever there is a change, we are first checking if someone who was using this component, did they provide a state variable for the input value or not, because it was an option. If it is provided, then we just set the props input value state dot set. So this is how we are setting a new value. So event dot value dot clone um, towards, let me go to the end right here. So we are using the clone method here, event value dot clone, and we set it to the use state value that was passed. So we cloned it, we passed it, so we just get as reference, and then we call the set on that one. That's how we set the value. We don't need to propagate that event back up. So once this value is set, then it will reflect automatically over here in the account form. So we have the username, and if I go back down in the text input, I pass input value state, user name.clone, it will automatically be reflected. In the next video, we will cover how the spawn method is used or the future is used, and how this username that we captured from the lib text input atom, how this one is used calling the API. So in the next video, we'll cover a few things before we wrap it up. That will be how the APIs will be called if there was an actual API project, and how do we use this captured value. And we'll briefly also look into the store from the Fermi that I have used, and some tips on how to use it properly as well. As always, thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.